I could never in my wildest nightmares have ever imagined the horrors that could plague even the most simple of life's enjoyments. The darkness that could invade any world, whether it be real or fictional. It all started the day me and my girlfriend were talking about video games we used to play growing up, and games that we used to enjoy. Over the years of my childhood, I've collected several games pertaining to several different consoles, but we both found the topic of the N64 to be the most fun. So that day, we decided to pick up one from my uncle's video game store and perhaps even pick up one of the greatest Nintendo 64 titles, Super Mario 64. Now when we got there, it took some time and a lot of browsing, but we were able to find the game after about an hour or so in several bins he had placed throughout the store. The only copy he had as it appeared. As well as that, we found an N64, the last one that he had in stock ironically, and the best part about it was he gave it to us for free. He told me that it had been bought and returned nearly 15 times since it came into his possession, and now he was just looking to get rid of it. He also told me that ironically the game was always returned with it as well, as they always seemed to be bought together. He had heard that something was wrong with one or the other, and that some people went as far to tell him that they were evil, made in hell, things like that. Seeing as how he only heard the story from 3 out of 15 customers, I brushed it off as some hysterical story told by people who decided they simply didn't want to keep the system. An excuse, if you will. I gave him $20 for a Super Mario 64. We went back home after being gone for about an hour and a half. When I got home, I laid the system by my living room TV and started to rummage through the old boxes where I kept all sorts of old games, ranging from a classic Atari games to the ever-popular Dreamcast. It was actually sort of strange, because in these boxes I found that I owned every major console except for an N64. Well, until now anyways. I pulled out of my box of all the N64 games in it and began to dig through it. I found games like The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, as well as its sequel, Majora's Mask, and 2 Castlevania titles for the system, and so on. Then it was time to hook it up. After everything was set up, my girlfriend decided that she wanted to put in Super Mario 64 first, and after some effort, the game is ready to go. "It's a me, Mario," it called in its upbeat pitch. My girlfriend decided to mess with Mario's face a bit before finally pressing start on her purple controller, and then the screen transitioned to the file select screen. There were some files already stored on the game. In fact, all 4 slots were filled, each having just started the game, because there were no stars on any file, so we started deleting them. After we deleted one, the game froze, and there was a deafening screech coming from our TV speakers. And it sounded almost as if someone was screaming from the game itself. My girlfriend turned off the system after 5 seconds. After a moment or so, she flipped it back on and we went back to the file select screen. Strangely enough, the file that we had deleted on file 1 was back, but this time it had 66 stars, even though previously it had none. So once more she deleted it, and again it made a loud screeching sound. This time I swear to God it was louder than before, to the point where we both fell back, covering our ears. As I was closer to the plug than the system itself, I jerked it out of the wall. This time, before we bothered trying, I took the game out of the system and took it into the kitchen. It turned out that it was really dusty, which explained, at least to me, why the game was reacting the way it was. Although it was still weird. After cleaning it with a Q-tip, I took it back into the living room. I handed it to her, and she plugged the console back into the wall and we were ready to go. By now it was getting dark out. There was no light in the room and we couldn't plug in our lamp because the system and TV took up all the outlets, so we were forced to play in the dark. For me, something didn't feel right because for some reason I was filled with a sense of nervousness that I could not quite explain. I shook it off and turned on the system. When we were back to the file select screen, each file that was there previously was gone, oddly enough, which to me confirmed my suspicion that it was just a dirty game messing up. So we started a new game on file 1, and the screen lagged like it were a CD or something. But after about a minute, it started up normally. We got the opening scene with Peach inviting Mario to the castle, and the camera, as usual, followed up to the pathway to the giant green pipe which Mario leapt out of. She was in control of the game and took Mario directly into the castle. When she opened the door to the castle, there was a prolonged pause which made me nervous. Once again, the loud screeching sound that ruined our game previously shot through our ears, but this time it felt like glass was jabbed into our eardrums. We were both overwhelmed because of the terrible screaming, and I couldn't even think to reach the system to the plug. After about 30 seconds it stopped, and we looked up to the TV. Mario had somehow found his way to Big Boo's haunt, as the mansion that had never appeared this creepy when I used to play it loomed over Mario's head ominously. "What the hell?" I said as I regained myself. My girlfriend was still getting herself together, and it took her a minute to process what was going on. I took the controller now and took a good look at the mansion itself. It was nothing like it was supposed to be. It had castle-like features, actually, and was covered totally in blood and rust. The sky had black and red colors about it, complemented by the black clouds that seemed to pass by in an instant. I noticed that a new tower was coming out of the mansion, and upon getting a good look at it, I noticed several figures hanging from it. The whole screen faded to white like it does in the entrance to a room, or when you look up at the skylight and go to the world that you obtained the wing cap in. When Mario reappeared, he had somehow made it on top of the tower, on a platform that went all the way around. The sky had a gloomy look to it as each cloud passed over the tower, as dark as the night sky, and lightning began to rule the sky and illuminate the clouds. I tried for the first time to move Mario forward, but a bolt of lightning stopped any movement that I was willing to make at the moment. I dropped the controller. My heart began to race. I didn't know what to expect, and I could see the look in my girlfriend's eyes that a strong sense of paranoia had overcome her because I constantly noted her looking back behind us in the shadows that covered the room. With hesitation, I took the controller in hand, and I moved Mario forward about a foot or so before something fell from the top of the screen and the camera zoomed in on it. It was a depiction of Mario with a noose around his neck. We both yelled out and I dropped the controller on the floor. I moved back as quickly as possible. Mario's clothes were ripped all over, exposing several parts of his body. Underneath the clothes, we can make out stab wounds from either a knife or a dagger, which more than likely caused the blood splatter all over his skin and remaining clothing. But the most grotesque part of the image were his eyelids and mouth, sewn shut with blood trickling down his cheeks and chin. I was appalled at the gruesome sight. My heart was racing, and I swear to this day at that moment the dead Mario fell from the top of the screen that I heard something run into my bedroom. All the hung figures were of Mario's. All the exact same, with eyelids and mouths and stab wounds. I worked up all the courage I could muster. I again unplugged the N64, which turned off, but not at that instant. Before the TV went black, the hung Mario's face, underneath his sewn lips, was smirking at us. I didn't want to get up, not even to turn on the lights. I wanted to remain in that exact spot sitting down, because at least there I felt somewhat safe. But for my girlfriend's sake, I plugged in the lamp and lit up the room. Everything was peaceful, perhaps a calm after the storm. And I took a deep breath and sat back down. I could not get that image out of my head, that smirk. I felt powerless as to what my mind wanted to remain on. I sat on the floor next to my girlfriend and hugged her. I picked her up and took her back to bed. Who in the hell would make a game like that? It had to be the game. It had to be hacked. It's the only thing that made any sense to me. What I saw in that game I would define as evil in its sickest form. Without a word between us, we laid in bed for what felt like hours before finally one of us broke the silence. She told me that she wanted to get rid of that game as soon as possible, as it was already late and I decided it would be best to wait until tomorrow because I was sure my uncle's store was closed and GameStop didn't take games that old. So we stayed in bed and agreed that we would not play it again. But I could not get it out of my head. Still, I wanted to know why or how this was done. My curiosity got the better of me in the end, and after she had fallen asleep, I quietly got out of bed, went back into the living room, plugged in the N64, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't have to. The game itself started. And not only that, it picked up exactly where I left it. I was astounded by this because I had never seen the system do anything like that. Right then and there, I knew that there was more to this, and I knew I had to know what it was. I was drawn in, fascinated. I got a good look around the tower. Despite being disgusted, I was morbidly fascinated by the entire scene. The paranoia it would convey was intriguing. After a few minutes of looking around, I pressed the pause button, and again the screen faded, this time to black, and it took me all the way back to the file select screen, and I found myself with more questions than answers. All the files were back again. File 1 had 66 stars, while files 2, 3, and 4 had none. I tried to remember back to when we picked the file, and I was certain that they were not there. I tried loading 4 first, and in response the game showed me a picture of Mario, dead in a pool of his own blood, with eyeballs and entrails hanging out. After a shudder, it allowed me to hit B and go back. I tried loading file 3, and again I got another appalling picture. It was Mario, once again staring directly into the screen, with bloodshot eyes that looked so close to real, I really thought they were. His mouth was gaping open, and his tongue missing, well, from his mouth at least. I examined further and realized that Mario's tongue was wrapped around his throat, and that he was being strangled with it. I heard a chuckle of sorts, not from the game, but it sounded like it was directly behind me. I ignored it against my better judgment. I tried to start up file 2 now, and a video began to play. Mario was strapped down on the table in a decrepit version of the castle's entrance hall. The stones were all black, blood oozing from the cracks in between each of them. The curtains that hung from the ceiling were tattered and falling apart, and they appeared to be worn with the years. In the background, Peach and Toadstool were strapped to both sides of the door that led to the basement area. Toadstool had the mushroom on his head torn off, and I could make out his skull showing through the still fresh wound. He was obviously dead. Peach sent me into a state of awe. Her skin was peeled off, and I could see fully formed was her head, which remained untouched. Jesus Christ, I said, silently as the video game continued. Mario struggled for freedom as the door upstairs opened, and a black mass slowly came through. Its footsteps solemnly echoed through the silent hall, the curtains on the ceiling casually to its passing. As it moved down the steps and towards him, Mario pulled and pulled, but found no way to escape the situation that he found himself in. And in response, he began to beg for his life and pray. The black mass inched even closer to the hero. It seemed as though Mario gave up. The black mass walked around the table and stopped directly in front of Mario. Again, the hero begged and pleaded for his life. He told the black mass he would do anything, only spare him for any crime he must have committed against it. And I saw a tear roll down Mario's cheek, and he closed his eyes tightly. A rope tied around his neck, and he gagged, and only took in heavy breaths. I couldn't see a hand so much as touch the rope, or where it even came from, but it indeed was there, with just enough slack so that Mario could breathe. Deep lacerations cut through Mario's clothes, and blood by the gallons covered him in a crimson pool. He screamed, begged, pleaded, asked for death, but it was not given to him. The cuts continued until the floor was covered in the dark red blood, exuding slowly to the floor. Finally, the swipes and stabs ceased altogether, and it was a deep, methodical silence that only the gasp of misery by Mario filled. Before I could so much as think on what I had just seen, his eyes and mouth were forced shut, and I could see it for myself. A black needle going through both of his eyelids and mouth simultaneously, effectively silencing him other than his muffled screams. Even more blood came through the fresh wounds and covered up his face. The rope then tightened around Mario's neck, although he made no effort to escape. It was over. After a few short grunts, Mario was silent altogether, with not so much a breath or movement. His face was terror, personified. And even though this was a video game, the pain one would have to endure, the torture, my God. Again, before the screen faded to black, that Mario smirked at me. I sat in silence. The title screen with Mario's head came up, only it wasn't the same Mario. The background was all black, and the Mario was the same Mario from the scene that I had just watched, still smirking at me. After much debate, I decided to keep going. I went to file 1, and with all the courage that my heart could muster, I loaded it. 66 stars. The game loaded to a demonic laugh, and a black sky filled with very blood-red clouds. Repeatedly, I could hear a dark, brooding voice saying, "Game over." Like Mario would after you lost all your lives. But still demonic. The Mario that I was controlling was the same Mario that I had seen killed on the title select screen. Screams, torment, and bodies littered the pathway to the castle. The bodies of Peach, several toadstools, and at the end, a dead Bowser, whose head was missing and whose body was impaled on a spike, right outside the bridge. I entered the castle and found myself back at Big Boo's haunt. I didn't question anymore, I just went with it. The scene had not changed, not even slightly, and ignoring all the graphic details, I entered the mansion to what I was sure would strike my heart in every way, shape, and form. I could feel something circling around, enclosing me, but I ignored it. I had to. I needed to know what this was, or what was going on. It whispered in my ear. I was sure of it. I gulped as the screen transitioned to the entrance of the hall of Big Boo's haunt, the room with all the doors. The bodies of faceless Marios were hung all over the ceiling, illuminated only by torches. I could feel sweat trickling down my neck as I saw a standalone figure all the way up on the upper balcony. I moved Mario slowly towards it. I was afraid. I'm more than willing to admit that. And I have never been more afraid in my life. I jumped up the steps one at a time, moving cautiously and carefully. It was another hung man, that was for certain, but it's who it was that I'll never forget. As I reached the body, I hesitated, but zoomed in on it. I began to tremble, my hands barely holding the controller. The figure was indeed a man hung by a rope. That man had his eyes and mouth sewn shut, just like Mario, and was bleeding profusely from his eye sockets. That man, in all his pain, was me. He let out a scream, something haunting and bone-chilling, a wail like nothing I had ever heard. The screen began to flicker and turn to static. I tried to turn the screen off. I tried to unplug it and nothing worked. The TV wouldn't even turn off. I saw my corpse through the static, burning as its haunting wail had yet to cease. Mario would turn his head 180 degrees, and I looked at the screen, and with a smirk on his face, let out a wail just like I did. My head began to hurt and throb. I fell to the floor. And the last thing I remember from that night was seeing a black mass hovering over me.